Thank you, Anton. Thank you for coming, everyone. My name is Andrew Wilson, Professor of Ukrainian Studies here at UCL. So we have two Ukrainian MPs, Rasmus Nielsen, to talk about a set of issues, legal issues relating to the war, Russia's war against Ukraine. Three things in particular. One, the Un-Russia UN campaign, which hopefully speaks for itself. Secondly, the European Parliament's resolution back in November declaring Russia to be a state sponsor of terrorism, so what are the legal consequences of that. And thirdly, even more recently, only a few days ago, the European Court on Human Rights, in a big landmark case, declared that Russia is legally responsible for everything that happened in the Donbass, in the occupied parts of the Donbass, from May 2017, deemed to have been in control of the town, on which many legal consequences follow.
I'll just hold it for now. So the format is that our three speakers will first give a 5-minute presentation, then I'll ask some questions, then we'll open it up to the floor. So our first speaker is Dmytro Natalukha, a Cambridge graduate, which we'll forgive him for, but right degree, IR and politics. He's worked in corporate law at Baker & McKenzie and at UNHCR. He's currently a Servants of the People MP and chair of the Economic Affairs Committee, and also a member of the Parliamentary Assembly Council of Europe Permanent Delegation. Dmytro.
Thank you, Professor. Can I just ask you to use your mic a little bit? Of course. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's all right. Should be fine like this. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and an honor being here with you. My name is Dmytro Natalukha. I'm an MP from Ukraine. I am indeed the chairman of the Economic Committee of the Parliament of Ukraine, the guy who is unlucky to be in charge of the economics in Ukraine in the parliament during wartime, and fellow member of the PACE delegation, together with my colleague Lesya Vasylenko, and the co-chair with Lesya of the Ukraine-UK Interparliamentary Friendship Group. When we started to advocate the issue and to research the issue of the legality of Russia's presence in the UN, there was no debate in Ukraine on this topic at all. Everyone seemed to be accepting their presence there as a fait accompli. Everybody was sure that there was no way out in terms of countering them and correcting their attitude towards abusing the veto power. Russia used the veto power more than 146 times. That's more than all of the members of the UN Security Council combined. To be honest, we ourselves, in a way, thought that that will be something very hard to promote. Nevertheless, today is February actually, yeah, February 2023. We are here at the beautiful UCL, and the Ministry of Ukraine's Foreign Affairs is publicly stating that kicking Russia out of the UN is a state policy and one of the main objectives of Ukraine's diplomacy. In our opinion, the thing is that what we're witnessing in the United Nations is that it is the biggest swindle in the history of international politics. A country that was never supposed to be there is nevertheless present and influencing in a very bad way a body that is supposed and is designed to guarantee peace. When the Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991, what happened literally was that the guys just changed the nameplates from USSR to Russia. That is, that. So according to the Charter of the UN, which, for your information, has not been ratified by Russia yet, I think they are the only member of the UN who has not ratified the UN Charter until today, until this very moment. The Charter of the UN does not provide any succession policy. It provides only either the voting by the General Assembly, which was not there, or membership ab initio, when they were the signatures of the agreements that established the United Nations, which Ukraine has signed, Belarus has signed, but Russia did not. It was the USSR that ceased to exist. And nevertheless, here we are at this very point of history when we are trying to challenge us to kick a terrorist out of the UN, which is illegally occupying a seat in the organization that is supposed to guarantee peace. In our opinion, this is something that not just us, but the whole world should be concerned about. Because if you remember such a thing as the League of Nations, it ceased to exist precisely because it failed to respond to the challenges of that time, namely the attack of the Third Reich on Poland. And in failing to do so, the League of Nations has lost basically the purpose of its existence. UN is very close to follow the same fate. If it doesn't react properly, if it doesn't change itself, if it doesn't evolve and follow the demands of this time and of this age, I'm afraid that the world would need to rethink global security and international security for one simple reason, because the global security and international relations, the relations between nations, are based on very specific rules and norms and agreements that every country is supposed to follow. If there is a country that is not following those rules deliberately, that disregard any kind of norms and disrespects any kind of agreement, then we have a trouble with a rules-based society, with civilization as it is, because civilization is a result of a consent to follow specific rules and to fit into specific norms and patterns of behavior. Russia from the very beginning is playing this smoke and mirror game. Nothing is knowledgeable. You cannot know what has happened. Nothing is true. Everything is possible. Forget what happened in 1991. We don't want you to know. We don't want you to think about it. You cannot prove it. It hasn't happened. And this is the pattern that is being followed again and again and then over and over in Crimea 2014. That's not us. You cannot know it for sure. You cannot be sure. You cannot prove it. Disregard. Don't react. So this is something that we are constantly letting them get away with. And for this very reason, me, Lesya, and other members of our team are trying to push this to the logical end. We need to stop this practice and to make it clear to everyone who wants to be a part of the civilized world. Either you follow the rules, either you respect the borders and the territorial integrity of other countries, either you agree to the norms that have been distributed and agreed upon among other countries, or you're an outsider. And here I will stop and probably pass the word to Lesya.
Thank you, Dimitri. Vasylenko is an alumna of UCL. She did a LLM. Welcome. She's also worked in corporate law and is also a member of the Ukrainian PACE delegation. She's an MP, but for the Hollis Party, and her committee is Environmental Policy and Nature Management. She's also founder of the Legal 100 NGO, which provides help to servicemen and women and veterans. And is co-chair of the Interparliamentary Relations Group to the United Kingdom. Vasylenko.
Thank you. I will have to hold this. I don't have a jacket for convenience, but it's definitely an honor to be speaking at my own alma mater. I was a student here back in 2010, 2011, doing my LLM in international public law and international environmental law. Back then, I didn't know that all of which I have studied in so much detail back in Ukraine, but then also intensified here at UCL, would come into practice. And really, first 2014, and then 24th of February last year, was basically international law, especially international humanitarian law, come alive before our eyes. And when I ask myself, how is this possible that history is repeating itself again and again? And why are we humans so stupid, actually, that we don't learn from our past mistakes and that we keep stepping on the same, or in Ukraine we say on the same rake, or that just hits you in the face every time? The answer actually came to me when we started this campaign on Russia UN. A campaign about which I personally was very skeptical. I remember when Dmitro approached me and said, well, you know, Russia is in the UN absolutely illegally. My reaction was like, okay, this is the first I hear of it. Well, what do you mean? And then I was shown all the documents, and that in fact, Russia gained membership in the UN absolutely illegally as a result of, well, quite technically speaking, a swap of nameplates from the USSR on the 29th of December 1990 to the Russian Federation on the 30th December of 1990, when really one entity ceased existing, the other entity didn't yet form and wasn't yet known by that name. I looked at it and I said, okay, look, this sounds great, but why were we quiet about this for the last 30 years? And this is a question we got asked just 2 days ago when we were doing a similar presentation at LSE. And the answer is very simple. Sometimes mistakes are made in the past, but it doesn't mean that in the now and for the sake of future generations, they shouldn't be corrected. And as we were working on the campaign of On Russia UN, which I'm sure at least a few of you here are aware of because you supported it in the social media and you were talking about this in your communities, and thank you for that. But as we embarked on it, it became clear this mistake needs to be corrected. Now, if I may, I will step back a bit in history, and I definitely wasn't interested in these events when this was all happening. I was way too young. A lot of you, most of you weren't even born at the time, but in any case, it's important to be aware of what was going on. The price of the independence of Ukraine was very high. And that price came with Ukraine and also the countries who were supporting the independence of Ukraine, averting their gaze and their attention from some very obvious breaches of procedures, of values, and of international law. The general rule of thumb behind Ukraine and the other post-Soviet states gaining their independence was that the world overall adopts the general strategy and policy, in short, formulated as Russia comes first. And whatever Russia wants, Russia gets. And this was a convenience. This was a convenience for everyone because in return, Russia, well, grinding their teeth, but still recognized the independence of all these different states. And Russia offered cheap resources, especially energy resources. Russia offered interesting economic markets. And Russia was all about quick and cheap gains. So Russia comes first was for the longest time a policy practiced all across the globe. Unfortunately, that policy came at a price. One of those prices was the breach of rules, and the breach of rules never leads to anything good. In this case, the results didn't really, the negative results didn't really let themselves, wait for coming true. So first of all, there was the Chechen wars. Russia, having declared and recognized the independence of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria in 1992, has invaded, has completely destroyed Grozny, has razed it to the ground, committed a genocide. The world averted its eyes. Actually, today, probably most of you in this room, I'll be surprised if somebody knows it, but how many of you know that Ichkeria was actually recognized as an independent state by the Russian Federation? Show of hands? No? A new fact? Yes, it was a new fact actually to most of us not so long ago. After that, there was Georgia in 2008, and after that, there was Ukraine in 2014. Well, Moldova was Transnistria was actually even before that on the onset. Well, the point that I'm making with this historical background of things is that too many rules were broken too many times, and this allowed for the world to sink into aggression, Russian aggression, and having to deal with the consequences of it. And now what we are trying to do was raising awareness about where the mistake was made, where those rules were breached, and making sure that we return the UN and the world and the international community to a basic rule-based society where the rule of law is not just a theoretic principle, but where it is brought back into practice, is that that organization, which was set out after World War II to do exactly that, prevent conflicts, prevent wars, prevent aggression, that it continues to do exactly that, and that it is able to do. Because at the moment, Russia's hold on the UN is basically a paralysis. It's as if it was a terrorist, and Russia is a terrorist state, holding the whole world hostage with its veto power, which is, it doesn't just use, it abuses it. 146 times Russia used the veto power. This is more than all of the other permanent member states combined. That's not right in the least of it, but most importantly, it's not right by law and by procedure. So this is the claim that we are making, and this is the argument that we are asking our vis-a-vis politicians, government officials to support across the globe. And this is the campaign on Russia UN and what lies at the core of it. Now, I think I'll stop at that, and I think there's follow-up questions to go with it.
There will be. Thank you, Lesya. Third is our own Rasmus Nielsen, lecturer in politics here at UCL, where he specialises in post-Soviet politics, where we were just having a discussion about dropping that label maybe next year, and the international relations of the region. Rasmus.
Thank you, Andy. I think I'll avoid trying to put it on. That could take the rest of the day, I think. I know there'll be lots of questions. There'll be a discussion coming, so I'll try to keep this really, really brief. Just a couple of comments to what we've heard so far along the same lines of Russian membership of the UN and all that. It comes down to two things, obviously. It comes down to whether Russia can be removed from the UN, and it comes down to why it should, if it should. Whether it could is the first issue, because, of course, as we know, on the one hand, there is no doubt about Russia's guilt in this matter. None of us here have it, and there is none following any fact we can find. So that's straightforward. And also, in several votes we've seen in the UN, the vast majority of member states have effectively joined in Western condemnation, at least formally. We can then, of course, have a look at how far they'd be willing to do that. If it went further, say, for instance, to try and ban Russia from the UN, and I would have my doubts. But certainly formally, the vast majority of countries have done that. When it comes to why Russia should be kicked out of the UN, I'm a lot more skeptical, I'm afraid. And this, again, I have to stress, has nothing to do with doubt over Russia's guilt in this war, but it has to do rather with the view on the UN. It was said before, if I understood correctly, that Russia would effectively, because of its crimes against peace now, in general and Ukraine specifically would have to be removed from the UN in order to we can either say save the UN or bring the UN back to where it was and where it should be. My prime argument would be that is too late. The UN that had as its core function the prevention of interstate warfare is de facto no longer. It cannot be there any longer when you have a permanent member, a member of the Security Council, not only breaching the peace, because we've seen other members do that before, but breaching it quite openly and almost recklessly. There's also the question, and I'll just bring it up again, nothing to do with trying to defend Russia or what's placed there. There is the question of what would come otherwise. Let's say Russia could be removed from the UN, that enough votes, enough countries could agree, for instance, that Russia had come in illegally back in the early 90s and that this mattered enough to remove it. Let's say that could be done. Then what is left is not the UN. Now, it may be a perfectly reasonable, good organization, but it is not the UN. And we would have to be clear over what that would mean. The fact of the matter remains that for the not the vast majority, but for many countries around the world, I'm thinking in Central Africa, for instance, I'm thinking in Southeast Asia and so on. Yes, the war, Russia's war in Ukraine absolutely matters, but there are other things more locally that matter more to them. I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that is a fact. And for those countries, the UN still has a number of purposes. It has a lot of associated organizations, economic, cultural, so on and so forth, human rights organizations, some of which don't work particularly well, but some of which do, at least within, if you like, their limited spheres of interest. Now, none of this is necessarily reason enough to just let Russia get on with doing what it does and keep it in impunity and let it, veto any resolution against it, as we've heard. But it does mean that there would have to be a realistic and thought through, which I'm looking forward to hearing my co-panelists talk more about, a thought through alternative to what is this new UN, what is this new international organization that should be there. I'll finish just with this little distinction, which hopefully sort of synthesizes what I'm trying to say. I would argue that the United Nations that was created after the Second World War, and which at least in principle still exists, although as I said, I'm not sure it exists in practice, that United Nations was there to show, to sort of symbolize the international system. That is, you became a member because you were a recognized state, not necessarily because you belong to anything more civilized than the basic requirements of a state. You have plenty of member states in the UN which have done horrendous things over the years. I'm not saying that's right, but I'm saying that is the practice which the UN has been created around for the last, what are we coming up to now, 80 years or thereabouts. So you can either have a UN that stands for the international system, according to which, Russia should not be kicked out, because it is there, we do need to deal with it, horrendous as its actions currently may be. Or you can look at the UN or an organization like that as symbolizing international society, which, going back to what was said earlier, has some rules and some norms for what we can call civilized behavior, which, apart, of course, from seeking to prevent interstate warfare, may also, for instance, go in and more, let's say, effectively and more sort of solidly try to defend human rights within a given country, going far beyond what, say, responsibility to protect has tried to do for the last 15 years. My point is these would be two quite different organizations. I would very happily sign up to the second sort of organization, which actually did try to enforce and stand for more substantive norms for civilized behavior. But it is not the UN we have now. And if we are going to change the UN, it will have to be a much more root and branch reform than simply getting rid of one, albeit very, very badly behaved member. Thank you.
Thank you, Rasmus. Vasylenko, Dmitry, would you care to respond to the main point? Without Russia, the UN would be a little less united in one destination. Should we get?
We should, in my opinion. But again, just to make it clear, we have to take into consideration, in my opinion, a couple of points. Point number one, the UN has set two precedents when they refused a national delegation with the credentials to be present in the assembly, to basically have a seat and have a vote. That happened after the installation of the Soviet regime in Hungary in 1956, if I'm not mistaken. And that happened during the apartheid policy and politics in South Africa. For 1 year in Hungary and for 3 years in South Africa, their national delegations have been excluded basically from the General Assembly by being denied the right to be present and to vote and to speak because their credentials have not been supported. So this was done precisely to send a signal to then ruling regime, the political regime, that amendments should be made in its attitude. In my opinion, we have a very similar situation because the second point you mentioned was the resolution of the European Parliament recognizing Russian political regime as a terrorist. So in my opinion, I think that having Russia in the UN right now, keeping in mind this resolution of the European Parliament, is in a way the same as having Taliban in the UN, because those both are terrorist organizations. So we're not saying that Russia should disappear as a country from anywhere, as much as I would like, I would want it, or I wouldn't, regardless of anything. The reality is that Russia will be there. It's just a matter of what Russia will be there, what kind of Russia will be there. Will it be the Russia of Putin, or will it be the Russia of another regime, a regime that is able to respect the international norms, agreements, and the international law, and therefore have a very legal place and lawful place in different international organizations, and not being called a terrorist regime. So I think that here, basically, what is happening is that we are following a precedent. And if this precedent is not being followed, then again, I don't see a point in the UN in general, because again, one of the reasons it has been established, it was precisely to keep the international peace and security.
That's any reaction there?
Yeah, just a quick clarification, I guess. So first of all, we're not saying that, Russia is an entity that we remove it for good once and for all, but we are saying that there must be a certain sanction for wrongful acts, and aggression, I think we all agree, is more than a wrongful act, it's an international crime. All the criteria, Russia has met all the criteria, ticked every box under the 1975 UN resolution, which defines what the crime of aggression is. Thus, there must be a sanction. A sanction, just like Dmytro mentioned in the case of Hungary or South Africa, is the suspension or the limitation of the participation of a country in the general UN affairs and UN institutions and UN bodies. And some of the UN bodies have actually already done that concerning Russia, the UN Human Rights Council, for example. And I think this is just the start. But what we are arguing with this Un-Russia UN campaign is that Russia should actually abide by the rules, because it cannot be the only country, it cannot be the only exception where it has not been voted in to membership, where it just assumed a certain continuity from an entity which already didn't exist when the Russian Federation came to be. And it can also not be the case where Russia is the only only country in the organization which didn't even ratify the charter. If you don't ratify a charter, if you don't agree with the rules, if you don't sign a contract with UCL, you won't be a student at UCL, right? So if you don't ratify the charter of the UN, what right have you to be part and to claim that you are there on the same page with all the other members working towards the same goals? And it is clear that Russia will not do it, because the goals of the UN, as inscribed in the charter, are to prevent aggressive wars, conflicts. The goals of the UN are to respect the international boundaries, the sovereignty of states. Russia has done none of that, not just in the case of Ukraine, but for many, many years. And what we are trying to do with the campaign, and what we urge the world to join in, is to actually make sure again that the rules do work, and that all the members of the organization, they stick to those rules. Because an organization as vast and as complex as the UN can only rely on its rules and on these rules to be followed. If there's a precedent set that you can actually ignore and step away and overstep the red lines, then the world will very quickly become a very ugly place, with other autocratic leaders taking this example as one to follow.
Thank you, Leslie. Dmitry has to rush to another meeting in a few minutes. So I'll just jump to another issue you've been involved in with the World Bank and others, namely Russian reparations. Given that Ursula von der Leyen has given the green light to seize Russian assets being transferred into some kind of fund to fund post-war reconstruction of Ukraine, what more could be done?
I'll get to that in a few seconds. Just to finish up on the UN topic, is that the funniest part of it is that Russia actually does not care, and it is prepared to leave the UN, because if you Google, you will find a very interesting fact that the military prosecutor's office of the Russian Federation has submitted a plea in one of the Russian courts to ban the UN website. Like literally, the guys want to forbid the population of Russia to access the UN news website. So they understand that when something happens, if they will be expelled, they basically want their narrative to be distributed among the population. They want to present their vision of why it has happened and what has happened. They don't want anyone to get access to the factual information and to the news of the UN. You can Google it, it's there. And this is absolutely insane. This is mental, but this is what is going on. They already have submitted this plea. But going back to the reparations and sanctions. Yeah, sure. Going back to the reparations and sanctions, I'll be very brief here. I think that, again, we should follow a precedent, and more can be done in the following. So there was a war in Kuwait in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken. In the 90s, the first one, yeah, 91. And Iraq invaded Kuwait. And what happened was they basically a number of countries, just like today, have frozen the assets of Iraq, the government assets, the financial, the sovereign assets on their territory and in their accounts, in their national banks. And what has happened then is that there was a body established in Kuwait that was accepting the applications for reparation by a homeowner, by a government authorities that has lost a building, by a family whose car has been destroyed, as little as that, literally. And they were processing these applications. They were verifying them and vetting them, right? And then they were sending them abroad to those jurisdictions like the United States of America, who have frozen those assets for adjudication in their court system. Their court system was making a decision on those applications, and then paid the amount that was stated in the application to the applicant. And then it took the very same amount that it paid from the budget from the frozen assets. of Iraq. So this was the case when Kuwait got access to reparations even before the war ended. And in a way, I think that this is the very same path that we should be following right now. And it is doable, it is possible. And we should take off the burden of the payments of the reparations off the allies, of the partners, and put it there where it deserves to be, on the Russian shoulders. So this is basically it.
Thank you, Dimitri. Do you have to head?
I have to go, unfortunately. Very
Thank you
sorry.
for your time.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Same question to you though, Leslie. And I know you were recently in Davos where this and other things were discussed. So can you tell us about the discussions there?
Well, most recently, I was in the British Parliament where these questions are being very largely discussed. And part of your question relates to the issue of frozen Russian assets. Frozen assets that, in the opinion of many Ukrainians, myself included, need to be seized and need to be put to good use immediately to serve the efforts of Ukraine countering Russian aggression as it is happening right now. Now, there have been attempts, even very recently, to amend certain legislation that is about to be passed in the UK, namely the Economic Crimes Law, with provisions allowing for the seizure of private assets as well as state assets, sovereign assets, so to speak. However, these amendments did not fly because there are procedures, as the government officials say. In my mind, it's a matter of political will and of the topic gaining enough traction. Now, Canada has managed to pass such an act allowing for the seizure of frozen Russian assets. Estonia has done so as well. Canada has gone even a step further. They have already analyzed the list of assets that have been located in Canada, and they have identified some which can already be put to good use helping Ukraine. The other countries are very far behind. I understand the issues that the UK may be having and that the court system is raising around the private assets, the oligarchic assets that have been frozen here in the UK, being seized and being put to good use. That will, of course, immediately excite a whole army of lawyers and law firms that will be first in line to try to reclaim those assets. Fair enough, there have been cases in the past, but when it comes to sovereign money and state assets in particular that sit in the Bank of England, that's a whole different story. Again, we are going back to what Russia really is, and Russia is a country committing the crime of aggression. Which is internationally recognized, and everybody knows essentially that Russia has committed that crime. So essentially seizing their assets would be a sanction, would be an adequate sanction for the crime of aggression, especially given that the UK is a committed partner, a committed strategic partner of Ukraine, and is making all kinds of efforts to help Ukraine in the military, in the humanitarian sphere, in the economic recovery. And it would be good to have at least some of those 18/26 billion that presumably sit in the Bank of England go to good use, if not directly to Ukraine and to the funds helping Ukraine, then to the funds of the UK budget that is allocated for the different Ukraine needs. Now, this is a work in progress. This needs political movement. This needs public support. This is a topic which, like the UN, is only starting to take shape and starting to pick up in the media, but it is one that I and many of my colleagues in the Ukrainian parliament are very much dedicated to.
Right, and Davos? Was there much discussion there?
Davos is an interesting topic because the Davos that happened in 2022 happened in May, so there was just a 6 month difference between because of the COVID, you know, that's in 2022, the January session of Davos, let's call it like that, had to be skipped. Now, the difference was immense. 2022 May was all about Ukraine. There was not another topic being discussed in Davos. It was just 100%, all the sessions, all the side events, everybody was talking and concerned about Ukraine, and rightly so, because it's not just a moral wrong that Russia is committing with the aggression they are waging and with the killing of the civilians and the nuclear threats and ultimatums and essentially terrorist acts all over Ukraine. No, it's not just that. The Russia's aggression has many dimensions and many consequences, not for Ukraine, but for the world. The food crisis, for one, the fact that not everyone on the African continent and in the Middle East and the rest of the global South recognizes that it's not the Ukrainian problem, but it's actually the problem which Russia created, doesn't take away from the fact that, well, actually, Ukraine is happy to provide the grain. Ukraine needs to provide and to export the grain to Egypt, to Northern Africa, to Middle Eastern countries. But we are unable to do so because Russia is blocking the Black Sea ports. Much of the energy crisis, again, is because largely most of Europe, all of Europe was on Russia's energy needle. And there's a whole line of issues which stem from it, and risks which haven't yet, thankfully, materialized, like the migration crisis, which could be a consequence of the food crisis if unresolved. So Davos was pretty much about this in May. 6 months on, in January, the moods have shifted. The moods have shifted, and it's not a comforting sight because, again, Ukraine is present, but at a much lesser scale, and there's much less urgency around the issue. What does this tell us? It tells us that, unfortunately, Russia is again gaining the upper hand in the game they like to play. That game is called protracted conflict. They've been at it since 2014 in Ukraine, so that's almost a decade of a war by which they tire out the resources of the opponent, by which they tire out anyone who's helping their opponent. And this is why Ukraine is so set on ending this with victory for Ukraine and for the rest of the world, well, no later as mid-2023. Really, the appeal that we are all making, all of us who are communicating with the rest of the world, is that there needs to be a full-on mobilization of military, of humanitarian, of financial resources to help Ukraine get the instruments needed to win this, to have gains by spring, to have victories by summer, because coming in to next winter, next fall, in the same situation that we were in last year in 2022, will only mean that that's it. Russia's at it again. We're playing their game of the protracted conflict, and unfortunately, so far, they are the experts at it.
Rasmus, would you like to add anything before we go to Q&A?
I can add two very, very brief things in regards. Thank you. Thank you. I'll try this. It's particularly in regards to the reparations. It's really brief. One of them is, I mean, I agree with everything that was said, with the couple of caveats. One of them being, don't forget, there are still quite a few Western companies active in Russia. They don't like to talk about it, but they're there, and they will do a lot of lobbying against attempts, or I would expect them to do it against attempts to confiscate Russian assets, because they would expect that their stocks in Russia could be confiscated in turn. So be prepared for that lobbying from a number of outside companies investing in Russia still. Second thing being, there's a more fundamental issue to do with, I mean, not least in Britain, to do with the fact that the financial disclosure laws and so on are still far too lax. Has been described by numerous journalists, academic authors, so on, over recent years, in particular Oliver Bullough and others, and that needs to be dealt with. As it is right now, it is still too easy, both for, let's say, misbehaving, and I'm using the word very, very loosely, but misbehaving states and misbehaving individuals to hide their money in places like the UK. There needs to be a discussion about how to get around that. But otherwise, yeah, absolutely. I think using Russian state funds or funds by sanctioned individuals that are frozen, using that for reparations sounds morally perfectly reasonable. I think it'll take a little bit of time to get Western countries around to it. That doesn't mean that it's not the morally right thing to do.
We started a little bit late, but we're still planning to finish at 6:30. Questions from the floor. I'll take them in pairs at least. Everyone at the front and at the back.
Okay, so is Ukraine stirring up problems domestically? I think I once used the phrase about the EU and Russia taking a baguette to a knife fight.
That's a very, very nice summing up of the questions. About Ukraine and its internal problems. We came face to face with Russia's aggression while we were trying to deal with our own internal issues. And through these years, from 2014 onwards, you know well enough how many scandals there were, how many issues there were that Ukraine was dealing with. But the main takeaway that all along Ukraine was still dealing with it. We even now we are not averting our eyes and saying that, oh no, ignore this, nothing is really happening. No, we're more than happy to comment in the news to the media that yes, we have internal problems. We are aware of this. Our anti-corruption bodies are intact and working despite the fact that the whole country is fighting against the aggressor. Despite all these missiles and drones flying over our heads, we are still having these institutions which are still dealing with the problems. We are not hiding from the fact that Ukraine is not #1 on the anti-corruption list, that we are far behind the rest of our neighbors and Western European democracies, and it's okay because we are still walking that walk. Well, first of all, there have been votes. Over the last 2 votes in Parliament have been dedicated to getting rid of the Russian elements in Parliament. That means that the mandates of these Russian-backed parliamentarians were taken away. Half of that party you are referring to has actually fled to Russia and has been declared as traitors of the state of Ukraine since the first days after 24th of February. And as for the Russian Church, there's a resolution that has been passed by the Parliament of Ukraine banning the Russian Orthodox Church, and you know that there were searches conducted by the special security services of Ukraine on that matter. So again, as I said, Ukraine is walking the walk, and I think it's overambitious and to expect that in one day we will fix all our problems. I think that we should aim for making sure that we are still dealing with them despite, and making sure that we are willing to admit to our mistakes and correct them. And you guys here, all of you who are Ukrainian, you have history in the making before your eyes, and you have the great opportunity to learn from past generations, from the politicians who are in place right now, and also from the history of what was happening, and to have the confidence, the courage, and the knowledge to call out on those mistakes and make sure that they are corrected. Well, the UN example that we were giving you is just one, and it's on a much larger scale than Ukraine. So, you know, the future is in your hands, as they say. The second question.
So the Moscow Patriarchate declared independence from not 47. So its statute is under investigation. That's the kind of legal status.
Well, if you want to go legalistic into it, yes, but essentially it means that the Russian Church is on the way to be banned completely in Ukraine.
3 years ago.
Yes.
Sorry, the second.
So the second question, well, let me start first of all by thanking our Polish friends for everything that they've done for Ukraine over this past year. It has really been incredible, and it's not something that we expected happening. But I think what it has shown is that by uniting with countries who were sort of considered from the Eastern Bloc and under socialist influences for the longest time in history, but who in fact knew the feeling of freedom, knew the taste of freedom for all those years. By uniting together and standing in solidarity, this is how we get the mistakes of the past corrected. And what the 24th of February has shown especially is that the Baltics, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, they all have a very strong position and a voice, and they have started leading by example. I will never forget again in Davos when there was the statement from the Polish Prime Minister, who has said that we don't care what Germany says, we're going to deliver the tanks anyway. And I can tell you, right after Davos, I went to Strasbourg to the Council of Europe. And the first thing my German colleagues said to me, well, you know, we're going to give you the tanks. This was before it went mainstream in the news. But the Poles were wrong. And you should say to the Poles that they should have never acted the way that they did. My answer was that, guys, I'm sorry, but if they would have kept quiet and played the game as you expected them to play, you would have still not been giving us the tanks. And that's the truth about it. So I'm glad that freedom has found a stronger voice, a united voice from all these countries that for the longest time were denied that voice and were denied that confidence to speak up, and were considered sort of like under the influence either of the East or the West.
Rasmus, anything to add on the West's learning all that there on?
Well, one quick thing, but it has also to do perhaps with what I'd advise Ukraine to very much think about, you know, coming on from the question about the corruption cases now and so on. Ukraine, I know right now, obviously there is one big problem, and that's Russia, but Ukraine has to be clear and has to show the world a plan for winning the peace as well. The point being, apart from the obvious dangers of Russian military aggression, the biggest danger I can see for Ukraine is also, and it was hinted at before by the other speakers, is that Ukraine gets forgotten by the West. If not this year, then the next, and so on. I take on board everything you said about, you know, the changes between the Davos meetings and so on. But the fact that, for instance, the EU has kept its focus on something external to itself for this long is quite remarkable, considering how the EU has for the last 10, 15 years been completely subsumed in its own issues. Yeah. I'm not saying it shouldn't be focused, but I'm saying already it is stretching itself. If Ukraine wants to keep that, if Ukraine wants to avoid a case where, let's say in 5 years' time, there is no immediate war at that point, you know, some sort of either kicking out of Russia or some sort of peace has been achieved. But if Ukraine then wants to avoid a situation where Ukraine is simply being forgotten by the West and therefore again vulnerable to aggression from Russia and problems internally in the state, then it has to keep going with a plan for how it keeps itself in the West spotlight. And obviously, yes, ideally most of the time for good things, but also, and I do think it's quite clever right now, from a sort of a media PR point of view as well, that Zelensky is very much trying to highlight when they go out and stop malfeasance inside the state. Obviously, you can only have so much, and there is an expectation the state should start functioning better and better as the fighting eventually will subside. But Ukraine has to think about how to keep itself in the West spotlight. It has to start having a plan for that developed now. Otherwise, when some sort of frozen conflict or peace comes, well, Ukraine could well be find itself forgotten simply by the West. Not because it should, but because that's what the West tends to do. So yeah, that's something they have to start thinking now about how to win the peace.
Right, I hope you remember all the questions.
I know the first question was definitely not for me.
Reformatting you.
The thing is, I can answer that, but it comes following from answering the other question regarding how to punish Russia. It sort of comes together. So I'm thinking maybe I should go second on that if you want to go first on the bits that were directed towards you.
Okay, so how to kick Russia out of the UN, reparations, possibly going to the budget.
Okay, the way that I understood your question is whether there are any other dimension than just the procedural arguments. Of course, so there's the procedural level which we've discussed, and there's the political level, the level of political will. I mean, Russia is clearly doing a complete wrong, and you know, the way to sanction malbehavior is to isolate the culprit from the benefits of international platforms. The Council of Europe has already done that. They've expelled Russia in the first week of March, which was the first international organization to do it. As I mentioned, some of the UN bodies have started expelling Russia as well. Well, expelling. A Council of Europe expelled, the rest are suspending. The International Civil Aviation Organization has not ratified Russia's credentials, and that is huge as well. And I think the list will go on. There's the morals as well behind it. Russia is clearly doing a wrong, a global wrong. There's the fact that Russia is breaching the UN Charter, almost every single rule in that. Where to take it? There's a special rules committee within the UN, which would be normally eligible to look at such cases. So the procedures are there and are in place, but at the end of the day, this rules-based approach, these procedures, they come down to a political will. And at the moment, that political will is not yet formed. There's no kind of critical mass within the UN that would be happy to push on these questions. And the role of politicians like myself is actually to go around together with our government bodies. Our MFA has adopted this position that Russia has no right to be in the UN at present, and to go around shaping that political will. And this is exactly what we are doing. There was another one, right, on sanctions?
Possibly being used to fund the Ukrainian projects.
But yes, definitely that is in the books. When we are talking about that money being used to assist Ukraine, it's to assist Ukraine stand against all the consequences of Russia's aggression. And these consequences, like the dimensions of Russian aggression, are different. The consequences are also very different and have many different dimensions. And one of them is definitely the funding of the government debt of Ukraine. But it will depend, again, on the sums of money we'll be dealing with and how soon we will be dealing with them.
Point one, for what you said, because I think that's where the answer starts, how to punish Russia. So couple of things to say very quickly. First of all, I think it's too late, because I think the UN that came into being after the Second World War has effectively ended. And the time to have done something serious root and branch reform might have been back in the early 90s, actually. So that's sort of the general problem. Second thing, I do actually think Russia is being hurt right now. There's a very good comment by a former deputy minister from Russia in Foreign Affairs recently, which set out the economic problems, and they are mounting. So something is happening now. But I completely understand you think more should be done. I don't think it was mentioned here before by all speakers really, that if Russia were to be kicked out of the UN, they might not necessarily care that much. I think it is telling that China and India have actually gone out and spoken very strongly against at least the use of nuclear threats. And also, of course, they may be taking oil and gas, but they're taking it at a huge discount. So I think already you're seeing something, but I would say probably try to push, get the West to push those countries to keep up at least some level of criticism. And then otherwise, for instance, use frozen assets for reparations. That's probably the most effective thing I can think of right now. In terms of the root and branch reform of the UN and how would such an international society organization work, I think the place to start, and you're right in indicating it would be a process, we're talking long time here. It's to start with the West living up to its own words. Go back to what I said earlier about, for instance, the West being a haven, not least Britain, being a haven for international murky funds. That's not a good idea. So to begin with, let the West live up to its, when it says we stand for certain values, what are the values we stand for? The EU could well start here together with Britain, the US, and say, so one, what are the values we stand for? And then be open and transparent about how we're pushing for those values. But it's a long, long process.
Thank you, Erasmus. Can I apologise that we didn't have more time for Q&A, but then ask you to thank both the speakers and the Metro who.
Thank you everyone for coming, and we're very grateful for our speakers for their contributions. And we're hoping to see you at our next event. Also, make sure to check our YouTube page because we just launched an online course on Russia's war against Ukraine with Dr. Andrew Wilson.
And thank you, Anton, for organizing and the whole of the UCL Society.